Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Second Book. The Letter of BELICENA VILLCA. Fourth Day. For all we have seen, it will be evident that the strategic mode of life could only proceed from a type of culture rather austere. In fact, the populaces of the Pact of Blood never stood out for any other cultural value but for the ability for the war. Because these populations, at the beginning, behaved like real strangers in the earth, they occupied the region where they lived, perhaps for centuries, but always thinking to leave, always preparing for the war, always distrusting of the reality of the world and demonstrating an essential hostility against the strange gods. Must not surprise then, that they fabricated few utensils and even less sumptuary objects. However, although scarce, things were enough perfect to remember that they were constructees, gifted of skillful artisans. To prove it would be sufficient to observe the production of weapons, where they always stood out. These were fabricated in quality and mass always crescent, being proverbial the fear and respect produced by them in the populaces of the Cultural Pact, who experienced the efficacy of their offensive power. The populations of the Cultural Pact, contrary to the occupants of the earth, believed in the property of the ground, loved the world, and worshipped the propitiatory gods. Their cultures were always abundant in the production of utensils and sumptuary and ornamental articles. Among them was accepted that the work of the land was despicable for men, even if it was practiced by obligation. Their major ability was, instead, in the commerce, what would serve them to diffuse their cultural objects and to impose the worship of their gods. According to their beliefs, men had to be resigned to their luck and try to live in the best form in this world. Such was the will of the gods, which could not be challenged. And to please that will, the correct was to serve his representatives in the earth, the priests and the kings of the cult. The kings transmitted to the populations the voice of the gods, and begged to the gods for the favor of the population. Stopped the arm of the king's lovers of war, and interceded for the populaces when the exaction of taxes became excessive. They were the authors of the law, and sometimes they distributed justice. What ills would not obeyed over the population if the priests were not there to appease the wrath of the gods? On the other hand, according to them, it was not necessary to search the wisdom to progress culturally and reach a high grade of civilization. Was enough to seek the perfection of knowledge, for example, was sufficient to surpass the utilitarian value of utensil and then stylize it until transform it into an artistic or sumptuary object. The wisdom was property of the gods, and they hated that men invaded in their dominions. Men should not comprehend, just know and develop what they know, until, in a limit of excellence of the thing, this guide to the knowledge of other things that would be also necessary to improve, multiplying in this way the amount and quality of the cultural objects, and evolving to forms more complex of culture and civilization. Thanks to the priests, because they condemned the heresy of the wisdom, but approved with enthusiasm the application of the knowledge in the production of objects that would make more pleasant the human life. The civilizations of refined customs and exquisite luxuries significantly contrasted with the austere way of life of the populations of the Blood Pact. In the beginning that difference, which was logic, not produced any effect in the populations of the Pact of Blood, always suspicious of what could debilitate their warrior way of life. One fall would be produced, prophesied the wise warriors, if they allowed that the foreign cultures contaminated their customs. This certainty allowed them to resist for many centuries, while in the world the civilizations of the Cultural Pact grew and extended. Nevertheless, with the pass of the centuries, and due to numerous and varied reasons, the populations of the Pact of Blood ended succumbing to the culturally populations of the Cultural Pact. Without being necessary to enter in details, it can be considered that two were the main causes of that result. By the part of the populations of the Pact of Blood, some collective fatigue that unnerved the warrior will. Something like the stupor that for moments usually invades the sentinels during a long surveillance. That fatigue, that stupor, that volitional weakness, was leaving them unarmed in front of the enemy. By the part of the populations of the Cultural Pact, a diabolic strategy, perpetrated by the priests, based in the exploitation of the warrior fatigue through the temptation of the illusion. In this way, the populations of the Pact of Blood were tempted with the illusion of the peace, the illusion of the truce, the illusion of the cultural progress, the illusion of the comfort, of the enjoyment, the luxury, etc. Perhaps the most effective arm was the temptation of the beauty priestess love, specially trained to turn on the asleep passions of the warrior kings. With the temptation of the illusion, the priests were trying to make blood alliances with the combatant populaces, seal the treaties of peace, with the consummation of weddings between members of the reigning royalties. Naturally, as it was about mating between individuals of the best lineages, and of the same race, usually the degradation of the pure blood not occurred. What was searching the priests with these unions? The cultural domination above the populations of the Pact of Blood. They had really clear that the pure blood, by itself, was not enough to maintain the wisdom, in the absence of the spiritual will to be free in the origin, will that was debilitated due to the war fatigue. The wisdom would make the spirit free in the origin and more powerful than the Creator God. But in this world, where the spirit is chained to the animal man, the cult of the Creator God would end dominating the wisdom, burying it under the veil of terror and hate. Once culturally submitted, the priests would have time to degrade the pure blood of the populations of the Pact of Blood to fulfill their own cultural pact, that's to say, destroy the works of the White Atlanteans. In my country, Dr. Setonal, things happened in that way. The kings, tired to fight and wait for the return of the liberator gods, were tempted by the illusion of a peace that assured them multiple advantages. If they allied to the populations of the cultural pact, would access to their advanced culture, would share their refined customs, would enjoy the use of many cultural objects, would dwell in more comfortable houses, etc. And the alliances would be sealed with convenient weddings, unions that would maintain safe the dignity of the kings and would not obey them to concede, in the first opportunity, the wisdom to the cult. They believed, naively, that they were making a truce in which they didn't lose anything and where they had much to gain. And that belief, that blindness, that madness, that incomprehensible fatigue, that stupor, that spell, was the ruin of my people and the worst fail to the Pact of Blood with the White Atlanteans, a lack of honor. Oh, what madness! To have believed that the cult and the wisdom could be reunited in just one hand. The result, the disaster I'd say, was that the priests crossed the walls and established themselves amongst the wise warriors. There they intrigued until imposing their cults and achieved to make them forget the wisdom. And finally, they avidly devoted themselves to the rescue of the stones of Venus, which remitted with promptitude to the white fraternity, through messengers who traveled to far regions. Only a few initiates had the honor and courage to refuse such condemnable claudication and dispose the means to preserve the stone of Venus and what remained of the wisdom. Within those initiates was one of my distant ancestors, who engraved the stone of Venus in the garniture of an iron sword, was a weapon of imposing beauty and notable symbolism. In addition to be the support of the stone of Venus, the crossword was upward opened in two iron quillons, that protected the hilt and gave to the said the form of inverted trident. The hilt, on its part, was of white bone-like ivory, but coiled, and was affirmed with conviction that it belonged to the horn of the Barbel unicorn, mythical animal which represented the spiritual man. And the pommel, made of iron as the blade, had also a pair of elevated quillons, that formed a second inverted trident. In the Middle Ages, as will be seen later, other initiates engraved in the blade the inscription on a red mortise. Well, this initiate established the law that such weapon had only to be in hands of the kings of the original lineage, the offspring of the White Atlanteans. Vainly were, in this case, the attempts made by generations of priests to destroy the wise sword. It was conserved while it was possible, and later, when that was not possible, it was occulted until the days of Leto de Tharsis, the ancestor who came to America in 1534. I repeat, the madness to gather in one lineage the cult and the wisdom produced a disaster in the populations of the Pact of Blood, the interruption of the initiatic chain. It was in this way, and in one moment, when the gods of the cult had imposed, the voice of the pure blood faded away and the initiates lost the possibility to hear the liberator gods. The will to return to the origin had been debilitated long time ago, and now they had no orientation. Without the voice, and without orientation towards the origin, there was no wisdom to transmit. The sign of the origin would not be seen anymore in the stone of Venus. The initiates realized, suddenly, that something had been disengaged between them and the liberator gods. And they understood, too late, that the future of the mission and the pact of blood depended as never before of the struggle between the cult and the wisdom, but a struggle that since then would not be fought out but inside, in the field of the blood. What made the initiate when they understood that irreversible reality, the shadows that abated the spirit, to counteract it? Almost everyone did the same. Starting from the beginning that what exists in this world is just a gross imitation of the things of the real world, and due to the impossibility to find the origin and the path towards the real world, they opted to use the last remains of the wisdom to impress in the lineages of purest blood a familiar mission, consistent in the unconscious comprehension, with the sign of the origin, of an archetype. It must be adverted the modest to this objective. The ancient initiates, the wise warriors, were capable to comprehend the serpent, with sign of the origin. And the serpent is a symbol which contains all the archetypes created by the God of the universe, symbol that was consciously understood with the uncreated sign of the origin. The initiates proposed, and there was no other option, that a family would work blindly on one created archetype, trying that the symbol of the origin present in the blood one day would be comprehended casually and would reveal the truth of the uncreated form. In some dogdecennial to some lineages, who had divine blood of the white Atlanteans flowing through their veins, was assigned a familiar mission, an adjective to reach through the past of countless generations that would go perpetually repeating a same tragedy, turning around the same archetype. As the alchemists stir the lead, the members of the chosen family would repeat untiringly the proofs established by the ancestors, until one of them, one day, turning around a circle traveled 1,000 times beneath other skies, would reach to fulfill the familiar mission, purifying in this manner his astral blood. Thus this would produce a transmutation that would allow to resolve the involution of the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age, return to the origin, and obtain the wisdom again. It is obvious to clarify that the familiar mission would be secret and that is actually unknown for the members of the offspring of the White Atlanteans. The mission demanded the fulfillment of a specific guideline which content would not have necessary relation with the objectives of the cultural community where the chosen lineage belonged, inclusive. According to the period, the guideline could result incomprehensible or just collide against the cultural canons in vogue. But nothing of this would matter, because the mission was impressed in the familiar blood, in the tree of the lineage, and the descendants' branches would go inevitably tending to the guideline, in an unconscious and superhuman effort to surpass the spiritual fall. Of course, the specific guideline described the archetype that would have to be understood in the blood, with the symbol of the origin, to transcend it and reach to the uncreated form. To some families, for example, was commended the perfection of a stone, of a vegetable, of an animal, of a symbol, of a color, of a sound, of a determined organic function or of an instinct, etc. The perfection of the suggested thing required to penetrate on its intimate essence, until touch the metaphysical limits, in other words, till the adaptation of the flawless form of the created archetype. Thereby, considering that the created archetype is just a mere copy of the uncreated form, would be possible to orientate again towards the origin if it was understood, the archetype with the symbol of the origin present in the pure blood. And there was the wisdom. Thus, the familiar mission not finished with the simple transcendental apprehension of the created archetype, but it required its spiritual recreation. Starting by an existent quality in the world, he would back over it one and again, untiringly, for eons, until penetrating in its intimate essence and realize its archetypal perfection. It would be recreated then, to the quality in the spirit and would be comprehended with the symbol of the origin. Only with this condition would be appropriated for the existence of the spirit, only thus the spirit would exist beyond of the created. Not perceiving the illusion of the created, but recreating what is perceived in the spirit and comprehending it with the uncreated. At complying it with a familiar mission, The astral blood, not the hemoglobin, would be purified and would make possible the transmutation which is aim of the Hyperborean initiates, or wise warriors, that transforms men into immortal superhuman. In the course of such not revolutioned way, the convoked ones, the called to fulfill the familiar mission, will be able to create magically many things. The initiates in the mystery of the pure blood would obtain, for example, a magic wine, a soma, aoma, or a amrita. After a millenary distillation of the liqueur, this one is incorporated to the blood, recreated, as transmuting nectar. Also, the manipulation of the sound permits to arrive to a superior harmony, to a music of the spheres. The spirit vibrating in the unique note, M, recreates the ineffable essence of the letters, the creator verb. And also such nectar as this sound, or other similar archetypical forms, can be recreated in the spirit and understood by the symbol of the origin, comprehended by the uncreated, opening thus the doors to the origin and the wisdom. Your family, Dr. Setonal, was destined to produce an archetypical honey, the exquisite squash of the sweet. Since distant times, your ancestors had worked all the forms of the sugar, from the cultivation to the refinement, from the grossest molasses to the most excellent honey. One day the empirical usage was exhausted and a metaphysical sugar, that is, an archetype, incorporated to the astral blood of the family, giving birth to a slow process of interior refinement that ends with you. Today the metaphysical sugar has been adjusted to the archetypical perfection and the effort of thousands of ancestors have been condensed in you. The searched sweetness is in your heart. It is your turn to make the last step of the transmutation, recreate that archetypical sugar in the spirit, and comprehend it, with the symbol of the origin. But I am not who have to talk about it, because your ancestors will make present one day, all together, and will claim me the fulfillment of the mission.